She looked him dead in the eye, cut the harness on the drop crate, and left him in the red clay to die. He was only a human liaison, an unarmed shovel maker from a cold earth port, dumped in a valley that ate its own dead. 200 orc warriors were already crawling down the 7 ridges, tusks lacquered black, plasma glaives sparking in the dusk. But when Warden Princess Usarai came back 3 days later to collect what was left of him, she did not find a body. She found a grave finished at moonrise, a war axe planted as a marker, an obsidian throne carrying a Sheffield spade across its knees, and a widower from Grimsby asking, very politely, if anyone in the valley knew how to make a decent cup of tea. The air in the terrace market of Verkatul had tasted of copper, burnt ozone, and fish oil smoke 6 hours before, when the elder Kajoranve fell face down between the stalls with a poisoned dart still humming between his ribs, and nobody moved to touch him. The valley called Verkatul had one rule older than its 3 moons. You did not touch a fallen orc of the Bloodstone clans. You did not loot them, you did not weep for them, and above all you did not bury them, because their god of the open sky was said to reject any warrior sealed under dirt by unclean hands. So when the elder Kajoranvet, oldest of the 7 ridges, dropped between a stall of dried river crab and a stall of iron nails with a slim black dart still humming in his ribs, the whole terrace town of stilted longhouses simply stepped around him. Children were pulled behind skirts. Traders folded their canvases and moved 2 stalls down the wooden boardwalk to keep the wind from carrying the elder's blood into their goods. Nobody screamed, nobody knelt, nobody even looked at him twice. It was the kind of silence that had rules of its own, and the rules were older than any of them. Warden Princess Usarai of the Emerald Tusk watched from her open palanquin above the fish pens and expected the human trader to step around the body too. The palanquin swayed in the salt wind that came up from the reed lakes below the town. 2 carrier boys, both young enough that their tusks were still capped in soft copper, held the poles steady. Usarai's true name was a rapid clatter of tongue teeth, the human translator flattened to Usarai, a name that sounded to her like a spoon dropped on a plate, but she had learned not to correct it. Humans could not shape the palatal click, and she had grown fond of the small indignity because it kept her patient. She was tall for an orc woman, 7'2" in her cured hide boots, with a green skin darker at the shoulders where the son of her mother's ridge had marked her from childhood. And she wore the crescent brand of her rank burned into the inside of her left forearm so that she alone knew when it stung. Her lower tusks were filed short in the manner of a warden. Wardens did not bite in ceremony. Wardens bit only in war. The human was called Neil Barrow. 41 Earth years, widowed, 2 lines of file, all the colonial office had thought worth writing. She had read the rest that morning out of politeness, because wardens did read the files of what they were told to babysit, and the rest was not much. Shovel maker from a cold grey port called Grimsby, on the eastern coast of an old wet country whose name the file spelled in 3 different ways. A man who dug graves for a living when the shovels were not selling. Sent out with the trade delegation as a cultural liaison because, according to the note the office had attached in a light hand as if it were a joke among friends, a man who dug graves for a living could not embarrass anyone important. He had a sister named Meg who worked at a public library and lit a candle every Sunday for their dead mother. He had a dead wife named Anna, gone 6 years, cervical cancer, no children. He liked strong tea with too much milk. He owned no weapon of any kind on the manifest, which Usarai had verified twice, because it had struck her as unlikely that a man would come to the Bloodstone Valleys without at least a knife. He carried, in fact, a shovel. Just one. A worn Sheffield spade with a scarred ash handle and his father's initials, SB, filed into the socket where the wood met the steel. He was carrying it that morning across his shoulder because he had said, with a small stubborn smile, that he was going to see the market, and a man who did not have his hands full in a market got them full of trouble. She had let him. She had not thought a spade would matter. He did not step around the body. Usarai saw it happen in the slow way she saw all disasters happen, one detail sliding into the next like the joints of an ill-fitting door. Neil stopped at the market square. He looked at the elder. He looked at the space around the elder, the neat empty circle the townsfolk had drawn with their bodies. He looked up at Usarai in the palanquin, and for a long moment his grey earth eyes did not blink. Then he set the spade blade to the red clay of the square, spat once into each palm the way a man spits before hard labor, and began to dig. Usarai's carrier boys went still. The market went still. The stall holder to her right, an old woman with 3 yellow tusks and 1 silver one where a jewel had taken the 4th, sucked in her breath so hard she made a whistle. A boy who had been chasing a river crab across the boards froze with the crab in his hands. Only Neil kept moving. Chunk of the spade. Lift, turn, chunk, lift, turn. The blade bit clean through the red clay. He was humming as he worked. Usarai did not recognize the hymn. It was slow and stubborn and in a minor key, and the tune had the shape of something that had been sung by many voices for a very long time in a very cold place. She jumped down from the palanquin. Her boots hit the boards. She crossed the 10 paces to him in 2 strides. She was aware, distantly, of the whole terrace town watching, of doors closing on the 2nd and 3rd tiers of the stilted longhouses above, of a rumor sprinting up the switchback road toward the obsidian hall of the matriarch faster than any runner could carry it. She caught Neil's elbow. "Stop," she said. Then, because the translator sometimes softened her, she said it in her own tongue, the full sentence, all of the click and rasp of it, so that no interpretation could dilute it. "Stop what you are doing, human, right now. Step back, turn around, walk away, and forget you saw him." Neil looked at her. He looked at her hand on his elbow. He looked at the elder. His hair, gone grey at the temples, was already dark at the roots with sweat. There was a small nick on his jaw where he had cut himself shaving that morning. He smelled like earth soap, cheap and lemon. "He was somebody's dad," Neil said. "He is not yours to bury." "No," Neil said, "he isn't. That's why it's rude to just walk past." He turned back to the grave and drove the spade in again. The old woman with the silver tusk made a small sound in her throat. Somewhere above, on the 3rd tier of the stilted longhouse behind the fish pens, a young orc drew a curved knife and a mother slapped his hand down. Usarai stared at Neil's back. The muscles under the traveler's linen were denser than a man his age had any right to have. Her mind, trained in the long, calm way of wardens, catalogued that fact and set it aside without comment. "You do not understand," she said quietly, and it was the first time in 6 years of diplomatic service she had heard her own voice sound this thin. "You are not being rude. You are being an insult that has a name." Kezoran Fet was the elder of the 7 ridges. He was the husband of the matriarch of the Bloodstone clans. "If you seal him under dirt with those hands, our sky god will refuse him, and the matriarch will send every warrior of every ridge down into this square to remove your hands from the wrists and your head from the neck, and then to burn what is left. That is not a threat, that is a rule. That is what will happen. Do you understand me?" "I understand you," Neil said. "How long do I have?" She stared at him. "Until dusk," she said, before she could stop herself. "The ridge runners will not move before dusk. They are proud people. They will not chase a man in daylight." "Right," Neil said. "Then I've got about 6 hours." He kept digging. She stepped back. There was a moment in every disaster, she had been taught, when the warden's job was not to prevent it. The warden's job was to witness it, so that later, when the record was written, it would be written correctly. Usarai took 2 paces back and, with a slow, careful movement that made her feel very old, she raised her right hand palm outward, fingers spread, in the warden's sign of formal observation. The stall holders saw it and understood. The market did not disperse. It settled around the square in a loose ring, quiet, still, watching. 100 pairs of orc eyes. Later she would remember thinking that no one wanted to walk away either. There was already the sense that this was something one would want to say one had seen. Neil dug. He dug straight down for the first hour, the way a man digs a well, throwing red clay up over his shoulder in even mounds. Then he began to widen the pit. He did not stop for water. He did not stop when a small crowd of ridge orphans came down from the upper tiers to stare at him, drawn by the sound of a stranger doing work in a place where no work should be done. He did not stop when a young priest of the sky god arrived from the shrine of the second ridge, saw what was happening, made 3 signs of warding at him with tusks bared, and then, with a strange lost look, sat down on an upturned crate at the edge of the square and folded his hands in his lap because he did not know what else to do. He did not stop when a runner in the black paint of the 7 ridges skidded down the switchback road, took one look at the pit and at Neil in it, and sprinted back up without a word. Usarai watched all of it, and because she was a warden and wardens are trained to look at what is not being looked at, she began to notice small wrong things that had nothing to do with the grave. 2 orc traders in bloodstone tusks who did not step forward to protest when every bloodstone in the market ought to have been howling by now, and who watched Neil not with rage but with a careful patient hunger as if they were counting his ribs. A third figure at the edge of the tree line behind the fish pens, cloaked in the black skin of a plains runner, but with the shoulder set wrong, angled the way a shoulder is angled when a body has been trained to carry a rifle high and tight and not a glaive slung. 3 orc-shaped watchers who were not orc behaving. Usarai marked them and did not turn her head. At the 3rd hour, Neil pulled himself out of the pit, sat on the edge with his boots dangling in, and drank water from a battered canteen. His hands shook a little. He did not seem to notice. He looked over at Usarai, saw her still standing in the warden's observation sign, and nodded to her once, as if to a colleague on a shared shift. "You planning to help?" he said. "I am a warden. That's some kind of rule against picking up a spade?" "Yes." "Fair enough," he said, and lowered himself back into the pit. She almost smiled. It was a small, ugly betrayal of her training, and she killed it in her throat. But she remembered it later. At the 4th hour, when the pit was chest-deep and neat-walled, a horn sounded from the highest ridge. It was a low horn, made of the hollowed thigh bone of some great mountain beast, and its note had the flat, sad quality of an animal that has been dead for a long time. Every orc in the square heard it and looked up. Then the 2nd ridge answered, then the 3rd, then all 7, one after another, in the way of a call being passed among people who have known each other since childhood. Usarai counted the notes. "They will come at dusk," she said. Neil grunted from inside the pit. At the 5th hour, the priest of the sky god finally spoke. He stood up from his crate, walked to the edge of the pit, and looked down at Neil. Then he looked at the elder's body, still lying where it had fallen. Then he looked at his own hands, which were the color of wet moss and had 2 long silver rings on the middle fingers. He took the rings off and set them on the edge of the pit. "When you are ready," the priest said in careful common tongue, "I will help you carry him down." Usarai turned her head very slightly. The priest did not look at her. His eyes were on Neil. "Thank you," Neil said, without looking up. "I am not helping you," the priest said. He said it with great care, as if picking each word out of a bin of similar words. "I am doing my duty to a dead man that others have forgotten. That is not the same thing. Please do not misunderstand." "I don't misunderstand," Neil said. "Good," the priest said, and sat back down on his crate to wait. Usarai understood in that moment that the story of what was happening in the market of Varkathul was already being written in 3 different ways by 3 different kinds of witness, and none of the 3 was going to match the others, and none of the 3 was going to be wrong. That was the thing about small events. They fractured in the retelling. The warden's job was only to make sure the fracturing was recorded in full. At the 6th hour, Neil climbed out of the pit. He was streaked in red clay from his hairline to his boots. His linen shirt clung to him in wet patches at the small of his back and under the arms. He looked, at last, tired. He walked to the elder's body without asking anyone for help, knelt beside it, and, with the same steady hands with which he had dug, he began the small hard work of preparing an orc for the earth. He straightened the arms, he crossed the wrists on the chest. He turned the head so the tusks caught the last of the low sun. He brushed the dust out of the elder's braided beard with the flat of one hand, and then he sat back on his heels and looked at the face for a long moment. And Usarai, who had good eyes, saw his lips move. She could not hear what he said, but she knew the shape of it. It was the shape a man's mouth made when he said the name of a person he had never met and would not meet, and asked that person, out of habit and courtesy, to be at peace. Then Neil stood, and the sun touched the top of the western ridge, and the horns began to sound in earnest. The bloodstone came down. They came out of the pine dark of the 7 ridges in loose war lines, tusks lacquered black with the pitch that only a war priest could mix, plasma glaives running blue at the edges where the charge coils hummed. 200 was Usarai's first count, and she was good at counting warriors, so she trusted it. 200, give or take 3. Give or take, she noted quietly to herself, 3 cloaked figures who were coming down the tree line off to the left, not with the war lines but parallel to them, and who moved not with the loose, swinging gait of orcs, but with the tight, economical step of soldiers. At the head of the main column walked a young war chief. He was 7'10" and wore the crescent brand of a bloodstone heir on both arms because he had a mother who had insisted on it. His tusks were the color of new coal. His name, Usarai knew, was Grokhur, and he was the son of the matriarch by her first husband, which meant that the elder in the market was his stepfather, and she suspected from the tight line of his mouth that he had loved the old man in the way a son loves the father who did not have to become his father. His plasma glaive was as long as she was tall. He had already told his mother, according to the runner's gossip, that he would bring back the human skull as a drinking cup. He stopped 6 paces from the pit. His warriors fanned out behind him. The market emptied itself into the doorways of the 2nd and 3rd tiers of the stilted longhouses, but no one left. Everyone wanted to watch. Usarai stood in her warden's observation sign at the edge of the square, and Grokhur, seeing her, hesitated a heartbeat before he chose not to acknowledge her at all. That was fine. That was correct. A warden was not to be spoken to during a killing. Human, Grokhur said. His common tongue was clean and slow. He had been to the schools of the Low Country. Step out of the hole. Neil stepped out of the hole. He held the spade at rest across his body, blade down, handle at chest height, the way a man rests the tool between 2 shifts of work. The elder's body lay behind him on the boards. His face was calm. Evening, Neil said. Grokhur bared his lower tusks. It was not a smile. You have shamed my god, he said, and you have shamed my mother, and you have shamed the ridges. Do you know what is going to happen to you? Something with those pointy sticks, I imagine, Neil said. Grokhur's honor guard rushed the trench. Usarai, half a lifetime later, would still remember what she saw next as a set of separate frames stitched together too quickly to make sense, so that only afterward, in memory, could she slow them down and see them as one thing. The first orc came in high, glaive raised for a downward cut that would split Neil to the collar. Neil did not move backward. He moved forward, inside the arc of the swing, and drove the point of the spade up under the orc's jaw at the exact place where every orc's beautiful crystalline gorget stopped 1 finger short of the soft skin above the tusk line. Usarai had never in her life seen anyone strike that spot. She had in fact been taught in her warden's school that no one struck that spot because no outsider knew it was there. The steel went in 3 inches. The orc's plasma glaive fell out of his hands and skittered across the boards. He was dead before he hit them. The second came from the left. Neil did not turn to face him. He pivoted at the hips and swept the flat of the spade blade horizontally without seeming to aim straight into the second orc's temple. It was the flat, not the edge, and Usarai understood in a small cold flash why. The flat did not stick. A stuck weapon was a dead man's weapon. The second orc's head bounced off the boards. The third orc was smarter. He hung back a pace, dropped low, and thumbed the discharge on his glaive to the wide setting, meaning to spray plasma across the whole square in a fan and let the physics do the killing. Neil, still turning from the second, was already inside the arc of the weapon, and he drove the spade blade two-handed down into the vent above the plasma coil. What a shovel had always done to soft ground, Usarai thought later, it did to the vent. The coil overloaded, ate itself, and the third orc's arm came off at the elbow. The whole thing had taken, by her count, 4 heartbeats. The square went silent. That was the first of the ritual silences. She counted them later. Groker stared. His honor guard, all 6 remaining, stared. The 200 warriors on the war lines behind him stared. Somewhere on the second tier of a stilted longhouse, an infant began to cry, and its mother shushed it, and the shush was the loudest sound in the valley. Neil stood at the edge of the pit, with 3 dead bloodstone at his feet and red clay on his boots, and the spade held quietly across his body, blade down, as if the 4 heartbeats had never happened. His breathing had not even quickened. There was no expression on his face at all. He was, Usarai realized with a small internal lurch, not looking at Grokur. He was looking past Grokur at the tree line, at the 3 cloaked figures who had stopped moving. Grokur said, in a voice that was carefully steadier than it wanted to be, "That was not what I expected." "No," Neil said. His eyes came back to Grokur. "You want to keep going, son, or do you want to talk about this?" "Do not call me son." "Fair," Neil said. "You want to keep going, or do you want to talk about this?" Grokur, who had been raised to answer such a question one way and only one way, opened his mouth to give the answer he had been raised to give, and then, for the first time in his adult life, he chose the other one. He lifted his hand. The war lines held. 200 warriors went from a coiled spring to a wary crouch, and Usarai, who had never in her life seen a bloodstone chief pull his people back off a rush, made a small mental note that she would tell no one, ever, because it was the kind of thing that could bring down a house. "Talk," Grokur said. Neil rested the spade on his shoulder. "There's 3 of your people at the tree line," he said, "who aren't yours. They've got the tusks, they've got the paint, they don't have the shoulder. They're standing like they were trained by somebody who taught them to carry a rifle and pretend it's a knife. Whoever wants you dead is standing right there, and they were going to let me take the blame for it after they killed you in the smoke." Grokur turned his head very slowly. The 3 cloaked figures at the tree line did not run. They had made, Usarai thought, the correct professional decision in that moment. Running would have confirmed. Standing still bought them another 3 heartbeats to think. "How do you know that?" Grokur said. He said it the way a man says a thing he already knows the answer to. "Because I've met their type before," Neil said. "A long way from here." At the palanquin, Usarai's earpiece began to speak, and it did not stop for a long time. It was the old envoy back at the embassy, and he was reading aloud, his voice reedy and unbelieving, from a file that had, only 3 minutes ago, been unsealed for a warden of her rank because a warden of her rank had put in a query about a man named Neil Barrow, and the query had triggered a set of locked doors deep in a hole she had never been permitted to enter. "Usarai," the envoy said. "Usarai, are you listening? Usarai, listen to me. The man you were assigned this morning is not who the manifest says he is. Usarai, this is not. Usarai, this cannot be correct." "Say it," she murmured, low, tusks close to the earpiece. The envoy said it. And as he said it, Usarai watched Neil Barrow standing in the market of Vurkathul with a Sheffield spade on his shoulder and 3 dead bloodstone at his feet, and she understood that the colonial office, in its long, slow habit of hiding its worst weapons inside its most boring paperwork, had sent her a man whose paperwork had been so boring on purpose. Neil Barrow, 41 Earth years, born in Grimsby to a father who made shovels for the coal pits and a mother who cleaned the church, married once, widowed, no children, Sister Meg living, one prior military engagement of record. Serial number long, discharge honorable, unit the 3rd Sapper Company of the Kessel Trench, on the world of Herrenvolk 3. Assignment, dig in, hold and cover the withdrawal of the last of the wounded when the tunnel line collapsed under coalition kinetic bombardment. Casualty count on the 3rd Sapper Company by the end of the 2nd day, everyone but Barrow. He had walked out of the collapsed tunnel alone at the end of the 3rd day, dragging on a length of comms wire the 12 wounded he had promised to bring home. Coalition Special Commandos had been sent in to finish the wounded. They had numbered 35. He had killed 32 of them with a combat trenching tool. 3 were missing, presumed dead in the collapse, never confirmed. 32 of 35, 3 unaccounted for. The envoy stopped speaking. The line hissed softly in Usarai's ear. She looked at Neil Barrow. She looked at the 3 cloaked figures at the tree line of a valley on a small orc world at the wrong edge of the map. She counted them again, because she was a warden and wardens counted things twice. 3. Grohur, who could not hear what she had just heard, but who had seen enough in the last 4 heartbeats to be a slow learner, made his second good decision of the evening. He turned to his honor guard and gave, in the deep guttural of the ridges, an order Usarai had not heard given in 15 years. He ordered the war lines to hold. He ordered the ridges to observe, and he ordered the 3 cloaked figures at the tree line to be taken alive. The 3 cloaked figures at the tree line chose, in that instant, not to be taken alive. They moved fast, and it was in the way they moved, all 3 together, all 3 exactly the same way, that Usarai understood the last piece of it. They did not move like orcs at all. They moved like the muscle memory of a very old training school, one that had been closed by treaty decades ago, whose graduates were supposed to have all been accounted for. The 3 of them broke from the tree line at a low sprint, drew short black projectile weapons out of their cloaks, and opened fire not at Grohur, not at the war lines, but at Neil. Neil dropped behind the elder's grave. The bloodstone honor guard rushed the tree line. Usarai's mind, working very fast in the small calm room it kept for battle, understood that Neil could not have fought his way through 200 orcs even at his best. He had never needed to. He had needed only to get Grohur to look at the tree line, and the tree line had done the rest, because assassins do not stay hidden when the plan has broken. From the pit, Neil returned fire twice with a small pistol he had produced from under the linen shirt in the small of his back, a thing so slim and quiet that Usarai, who had searched him herself that morning, did not know how she had missed it. And each of the 2 shots dropped one of the 3 cloaked figures at exactly the point on the plate where a plate stops and the seam of a cloak begins. 2 shots, 2 hits. The 3rd of the cloaked figures made it to the tree line before the honor guard cut him down. 2 down clean, 1 taken. That left, if she was doing her arithmetic correctly, one of Kessel still not accounted for. She filed the number and kept walking. Neil climbed out of the pit for the 2nd time. His linen shirt was torn across the shoulder where a round had grazed him, and there was a bright thin line of blood along his collarbone that he ignored. He walked, unhurried, to the 3rd cloaked figure the honor guard had run down. He knelt. He pulled back the hood. Underneath was the face of an orc, or what looked at first like the face of an orc. Green skin, lower tusks the correct length, upper jaw with the correct ridge. Neil, without ceremony, put his thumb under the left tusk and levered. The tusk came off. It was a prosthetic. Beneath it, the flat, pale face of a man from somewhere very much not Bloodstone stared up at the sky and did not move. "Coalition," Neil said, to no one in particular. "That's Kessel work. That's the school." "How do you know?" Groker said. He was standing behind Neil now. His plasma glaive was still lit, but he was holding it low, at the resting angle, the way an orc holds a glaive when he is no longer sure who the enemy is. "Because I built that school," Neil said quietly. "I mean I helped build it." We built it to train infiltrators for a war we thought was going to happen. Then the war happened somewhere else. Then the school got shut. Then the graduates got, reassigned. The coalition had a use for them. He stood up. He looked at Grokhur. He looked at Usarai. He looked at the elder's body, still lying by the grave, waiting. I need to finish burying your father, he said to Grokhur. And then I need to go up the road and have a conversation with your mother because somebody in her house wanted him dead badly enough to point 3 of my old classmates at him. Grokhur said nothing. His shoulders had come down a little. He looked like a young man who had spent the last hour discovering that the shape of his own world was different from the shape he had been raised in. And Usarai, who had watched a great many young war chiefs of the ridges have that discovery, thought that Grokhur was taking it better than most. I will help you, Grokhur said, at last. I appreciate that, Neil said, but I have to do it. If somebody else finishes it, your god still throws him back. That's what the priest said. That is what the priest said, Grokhur agreed. He turned his head toward the priest, who was still sitting on his crate at the edge of the square, holding his silver rings. The priest inclined his head in a gesture that was neither approval nor argument. It was, Usarai thought, the priest's job to notice the direction of a river, not to change it. Neil finished the grave. Grokhur stood by and watched. And after a while he sat down on the boards with his glaive across his knees, and after a longer while he put the glaive aside altogether and sat with his hands loose in his lap, which was, in the code of the ridges, a signal so profound that Usarai heard a small stifled gasp from the second tier of a stilted longhouse above her. The war lines behind him relaxed into loose observation. The 200 did not sheath their weapons. A bloodstone did not sheath in the presence of unburied blood, but they lowered them, and they stood, and they watched the human dig, and slowly, over the second hour, something happened in the market of Verkathul that Usarai did not have a name for. The silence stopped being the silence of a killing about to happen. It became the silence of a burial. The moon rose. Verkatul had 3 moons, but that night the first to rise was the small red one, the bloodstone called the widow. And by tradition, a grave finished under the widow was a grave the sky god was likely to receive without argument. Neil, who had almost certainly not known this, or perhaps had known it and did not want to say so, lifted the elder Kajoran vet into the grave with his own arms. Grokhur helped him with the last of it. The priest of the sky god, without being asked, stepped down from his crate and made the 3 signs of consecration over the body with his ringless hands. Neil filled in the grave. He did it slowly and evenly. The way a man fills in a grave, he means to be found again. He did not sing the hymn he had been humming that morning. He did the work in silence, and the whole valley let him. When he was done, Grokhur stepped forward and, without a word, planted his own war axe head down in the fresh earth at the head of the grave, so that the haft rose like a marker. Then he stepped back and raised his right hand palm outward in the sign of formal observation. He held the sign until Neil looked at him. He held it a moment longer, then he lowered his hand. "Warden Princess," Grokhur said, without looking away from Neil. "War Chief," Usarai said. "My mother is waiting in the obsidian hall," Grokhur said. "She has been waiting since the runner told her that a human was digging a hole in the market. She will want to know how the hole came to be finished." "She will," Usarai agreed. "You will accompany the human." "I will." "And I will accompany you both," Grokhur said, "because I think," and here his voice slowed and grew careful, "that the reason my stepfather was killed is a reason that begins in my mother's own hall, and I think that a warden and a foreign gravedigger should not walk into that hall alone." Usarai bowed her head very slightly. It was not a bow of submission, it was a bow of thanks. Grokhur returned it in kind, which was the first time in the memory of anyone present that a bloodstone heir had bowed to an emerald tusk warden in the market of Verkatul. Later, when the story was told in the ridges, this bow would be one of the parts everyone left in. They walked up the switchback road. Neil carried the spade over his shoulder. His shirt was stiff with dried blood at the collarbone and along one sleeve. He had not, Usarai noticed, so much as asked for a bandage. The switchback road wound up the western ridge in 7 turns, one for each of the ridges, and the obsidian hall stood at the top of the 7th turn like a black tooth set into the stone. Torches burned along the parapet. At the great doors, the honor guard of the matriarch stood in 2 rows of 6, faces painted in the white ash of ceremonial mourning. They saw Grokur, they saw Usarai, they saw Neil. They opened the doors. The hall inside was long and low and cold. The ceiling was ribbed with the bones of the great sky beasts that had once flown over the valley when the world was younger, and each rib was capped in silver. The floor was polished obsidian that gave back a faint blue reflection of the torches. At the far end of the hall, on a throne carved out of the femurs of a single ancient creature so large that the throne alone was the size of a room, sat the matriarch of the Bloodstone clans. She was very old. Her braids were the color of iron. Her tusks had been recapped in gold 3 times in her life, once at her wedding, once at the birth of her first child, once at the death of her second. She wore no armor and no weapon and no crown. She did not need to. She was the matriarch. Everyone in the room already knew. Beside her throne, in a loose crescent, stood 3 figures. 2 orc-shaped attendants Usarai did not immediately recognize. A third, taller and thinner, hooded in a fine gray cloth that hid the face. The taller one stood with the same wrong-shouldered stillness that Usarai had seen at the tree line of the market square, and her warden's mind, which had already done arithmetic tonight and did not like doing arithmetic twice, did the arithmetic anyway. 3, now 3 again, around the throne. Usari's earpiece said very softly, "Usari, that is the 4th. The 4th. Yes, she had not been wrong. Kessel had never been closed properly. 3 of 35 gone missing on paper, 1 gone missing off paper. The 3 at the tree line had come as the killing arm. The 4th had come as the manager. The matriarch spoke. "You have buried my husband," she said, in the low, careful common tongue she used with envoys, "with your own hands, in front of the market of Varkatul, on the day of his death. Human, do you know what you have done?" Neil rested the spade on the floor. The steel head made a small dry sound on the obsidian. "I buried a man who was somebody's dad," he said. "You have violated my sky god." "I don't think so, ma'am," Neil said. "I think if your sky god was going to say no, that little red moon wouldn't have come up when it did. I think your sky god's fine. I think whoever wanted your husband dead has been telling you your sky god wasn't fine because they needed you to burn my head and my hands and my body before I could open my mouth and tell you who they were." The matriarch did not move. "Continue," she said, after a long pause. "There were 3 of them at the tree line in the market," Neil said. "Coalition assassins wearing bloodstone tusks, trained at a place a long way from here that isn't supposed to exist anymore. They were the ones who put the dart in your husband. They meant for the ridges to blame me. 2 of them are dead in the square. 1 of them is tied up in a hut in the market with your son's honor guard watching him." Grocher inclined his head once, confirming. "And," the matriarch said, "the 4th. Neil looked at the taller hooded figure to the right of the throne. The hooded figure did not move. Neil did not raise his voice. "The 4th is your minister of records," he said, "the one you promoted 6 months ago after the last one died in his bed. She's not who you think she is. She's the one who put the school back together quietly on a private contract. She's the one who came out here to finish the job in person because she doesn't trust her own graduates anymore. And she's the one who told your husband that a foreign gravedigger had asked to see him this morning, which is how she knew exactly where he'd be standing when the dart went in." The matriarch turned her head slowly and looked at the hooded figure. The hooded figure moved. It was very fast. It was as fast as Neil had been in the market, and Usarai understood, with a chill that started at the base of her spine and traveled up, that the 4 of them had come out of the same school, and that if there had been a 5th in the room, the 5th would have moved exactly this fast too, because these were what that school had made. The hooded figure drew from inside the cloak not a pistol, but a short blade, black glass-edged, the kind of blade that was made to open a matriarch's throat between one breath and the next. And it was already reaching for the matriarch's throat when Neil put the flat of the Sheffield spade in the way. The blade rang off the flat. It rang the way a bell rings when a hammer is not quite the right size for it. The hooded figure recovered fast and cut sideways at Neil's belly. Neil turned with the cut so it opened linen and skin and not muscle, took the momentum and drove the spade edge down into the hood at the joint between the collarbone and the neck. He did not stop. He drove it through. The head came off. The hood fell open. The face inside the hood was a face that had once been human, before it had spent too many years in the surgeries of a school that did not exist anymore. And Usarai saw in the eyes, in the second before the eyes glazed, a look of very tired recognition, as if the last thing the woman had thought was that of course it would be Barrow, of course it would be him. Silence. That was the second of the ritual silences. She marked it. Neil straightened. He was bleeding heavily now from the belly wound and from the shoulder graze in the market and from a plasma lash across his back that Usarai had not even seen him take, which meant it must have come in the honor guard rush, which meant he had been bleeding for 2 hours and walking anyway. His face was grey. He set the spade point down on the obsidian floor and leaned on it. "Ma'am," he said to the matriarch. His voice was very quiet. "You want me to stay standing for the rest of this conversation, or is it all right if I sit down?" The matriarch stood up from her throne. She stood up slowly, because she was old, and Usarai understood that this was the first time in 12 years she had stood up from that throne in front of a foreigner. She walked the 6 paces to Neil. She stopped in front of him. She looked at him. She looked at the spade. She reached out with one hand and touched the initials SB filed into the socket. "Your father," she said. "My father," Neil said. "He made this. He made a lot of these. And you?" "I made a few. He was better at it than me." "You are not a soldier," the matriarch said. "No, ma'am. Not for a long time. But you were." "Yes, ma'am. I was. For about 11 months, a long time ago." "Kessel," the matriarch said. And Usarai's head jerked around, because the matriarch of the Bloodstone clans had no reason and no way to know the word Kessel. But the matriarch of the Bloodstone clans was old, and old people had listened to a great many conversations, and Usarai understood then that some things about her ancient hostess were not going to be known to her tonight or any other night. "Kessel," Neil said. 32 of 35, the matriarch said. 32 of 35, and the three came here, for you, eventually for me, first for your husband because they needed a war between your people and mine so they could sell weapons to both sides. That was the shape of the plan. My part in it was just to get killed in the market by your son so that nobody would ever ask who really threw the dart. I was a convenient prop. You do not like being a prop. I don't like being a prop. No, ma'am. You did not have to bury him." "No, ma'am, I did not have to, but he was somebody's dad." The matriarch looked at him for a long time. Then she turned, walked back to her throne, sat down and beckoned. 2 attendants came at once with a low bench, a cup of hot spice water, and a folded strip of clean cloth. The bench was set 6 paces from the throne at an angle that indicated formal audience, and Neil, after a moment of hesitation, moved to it and sat, because he was, at last, going to fall over if he did not sit. The attendants bandaged his belly and his back and his shoulder with the quick, expert hands of people who had bandaged a great many warriors and were not, tonight, going to pretend that a human was not a warrior. The matriarch waited until they were done. Then she spoke. "Neil Barrow," she said, "you have done my house a service that my house cannot repay in coin. You have exposed a traitor at my elbow that I did not know was there. You have saved my son from committing a killing that would have started a war he could not have won. You have buried my husband when no hand in this valley would touch him. My house owes you a debt. My clan owes you a debt, and the 7 ridges, by our old law, owe you a debt. I will ask you now what you would have of us, and I will honor whatever you say." Neil, who had been sipping the spice water because it was hot and sweet and he was cold, looked up. "Ma'am," he said, "I'd like a cup of tea." The hall went still, not silent, still. It was, Usarai thought, the difference between a room that has stopped speaking and a room that has forgotten how. "A cup of tea," the matriarch said. "Yes, ma'am, strong, milk if you have anything like it, sugar, not too much. And I'd like to sit somewhere warm for about an hour, if I could, because I'm going to be honest with you, ma'am, I am about done in. And then I'd like the transport that the colonial office was supposed to send for me the day after tomorrow to come and pick me up. And I'd like to go home and see my sister and finish the batch of shovels I was working on when they called me up. That's what I'd like. You would like nothing else." "No, ma'am. No title. No, ma'am. No land. I own a house. No standing in the 7 ridges. Ma'am, with respect, I don't know how to stand in the 7 ridges. I know how to make shovels. You do not want to become a lord of my house. Ma'am, with respect, I don't do lords. I don't do thrones. I don't do speeches. I do shovels, and I do graves when the shovels aren't selling. That's the whole trade. That's the whole man." The matriarch looked at him for a long time. Then, for the second time that night, she stood up from her throne. She stepped down from the dais. She walked the 6 paces back to Neil. She took the spade out of his hand. He let her. There was no strength left in his fingers, and she carried it back to the throne and laid it across the arms of the great bone chair, so that the socket with the initials SB rested on one arm and the blade rested on the other. Then she came back to Neil and stood in front of him and said, in a voice that Usarai would remember for the rest of her long life, "Then the debt of the bloodstone to the gravedigger of Grimsby is this: from this night, and for as long as the 7 ridges know their own names, no orc of bloodstone will refuse a cup of tea to a human of earth, no orc of bloodstone will bar a human's road, and no orc of bloodstone will lift a glaive against a human without first sending word to the house of Barrow in the port of Grimsby, so that the shovel maker or his kin may say whether the fight is just. And when the shovel maker or his kin says no, the glaive will not be lifted. And when the shovel maker or his kin says yes, the 7 ridges will fight beside your people, not against them. This is the debt, this is the pact. It will be written in the bone of my throne, and it will be sung in the low country, and it will not be undone." Neil, who had been staring at his own boots throughout this speech, looked up. "Ma'am," he said, "I don't know what to say." "Say nothing," the matriarch said. "Drink your tea." An attendant appeared at his elbow with a small clay cup. There was no milk, because there was no milk in a bloodstone hall, but there was a rich dark leaf brew that tasted, according to Neil, close enough to the tea of home that he would forgive the matriarch the milk if she would forgive him the small tear that was running out of his left eye without his permission. He drank the tea. He drank it slowly. He drank it the way a man drinks a thing he has needed for a long time and has not been able to name. Usarai stood in the warden's observation sign and watched him drink it, and she understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with the paperwork of her office, that she was witnessing the beginning of a story that would be told in the ridges for the next 400 years, and that when it was told, the shape of it would be true. She lowered her hand at last. Later, much later, she would ride back down the switchback road with Grocher beside her. He would be quiet at first, then he would say, "Warden Princess, War Chief, did you know?" "I did not, but you were assigned to him." "I was assigned to a shovel maker from a cold port." "That was the file. That was the file," Grocher said. "The file was the trap. The file was the trap. For me, for you and your mother both. If you had killed him, your ridges would have been at war within a week with 3 houses that had never wanted a war. And by the end of the year, the coalition would have been selling glaives to whoever won. It was a small, clean plan. It was almost a good one. It was undone by a man with a spade. It was undone by a man who did not step around a body. Grochur walked in silence for a while. Then he said, "Warden Princess, in the market, when the first of my honor guard died, did you see how he did it?" "I saw. He struck a place none of us knew was open. He struck it because he had spent a long time thinking about places that are open on people who do not think they are open. He was trained to think about it. He is very good at it. I hope, War Chief, that we do not have to think about it ourselves." "I hope so too," Grochur said. Then, after another pause, "Warden Princess, do you think he will come back?" "I think he will not," Usarai said. "I think he will go home to his sister and his house and his batch of shovels, and he will hope very hard that he is never called again. But I think," she added, "that if he is ever called, he will come. He is that kind of man." "What kind?" "The kind who does not step around a body." Grochur did not answer that. He walked, and the plasma glaive on his back was quiet, and above them the second and third moons of Gurkhatul rose over the 7 ridges, and the market below was clean and dark and closed for the night, and the fresh grave in the center of it had a war axe planted at its head, and a small wet gleam on the axe blade caught the moonlight in a way that would be spoken of, in that valley, for a very long time. In the days that followed, small strange things happened in the terrace town of Verkatul. The old woman with the silver tusk, who had been standing next to Usarai in the market, moved her stall 2 paces closer to the fresh grave, and did not move it back. The priest of the sky god was seen at the grave at dawn on the 3rd day, sitting on his crate, holding his 2 silver rings in his open hand. A group of ridge children began, without being told, to sweep the boards around the grave clean every evening at dusk. On the 5th day, a coalition trade ship that had been due to make port at the reed lakes below the town abruptly changed course and did not arrive, and no explanation was ever given, and none was ever asked for. On the 7th day, a small oiled wooden box arrived at the obsidian hall by Fast Runner. Inside the box was a shovel. It was not Neil Barrow's shovel. It was a new one, unused, freshly forged, with the initials MB filed into the socket where the wood met the steel. There was no note. The matriarch, who had by then received 100 letters of protest from ridges that had not been consulted and 100 letters of relief from ridges that had held the shovel in her old hands for a long moment. Then she rose from her throne, for she was becoming, in her later years, a matriarch who rose from her throne more often than she had used to, and she carried the shovel to the ossuary behind the hall, where the tools of the great dead of the bloodstone were kept, and she laid the shovel across a cedar bier next to a war axe that had once belonged to her grandmother. She did not speak. There was no one there to speak to. She simply left it there. Then she went back to the throne and sat down, and the light of the 3 moons of Verkathul came through the high slit windows of the hall and fell in 3 narrow bars across the obsidian floor, and she watched the bars move for a long time. Neil Barrow flew home to Earth on a colonial transport. He sat by the window with his father's spade across his knees and did not talk much to the other passengers. And when the ship came in over the grey port of Grimsby, he leaned his forehead against the cold plastic of the window and looked down at the wet slate roofs and the smoke coming off the chimneys and the small pale line of the sea beyond the fish docks, and he closed his eyes for a moment as if to hold the picture in place. His sister Meg met him at the terminal. She had brought him a thermos of tea. It had too much milk. He drank it anyway, standing on the wet pavement outside the terminal, with the rain coming down and the diesel of the buses hanging in the air, and he did not say anything for a while. And Meg, who had lived with him long enough to know when not to talk, did not ask. That night, in the small kitchen of the small terraced house on Cleethorpes Road, Meg lit a candle for their mother because it was Sunday. She lit a second one, without saying why, and set it next to the first, and Neil, sitting across the kitchen table from her, with his hands wrapped around a mug of properly milky tea, looked at the second candle for a long moment. "For who?" he said. "For an old man in a market who nobody wanted to bury," Meg said. She did not look at him. "That all right with you, our kid?" "That's all right with me," Neil said. Yeah, that's all right with me. They sat at the kitchen table for a long time and did not speak. And outside the rain came down on Grimsby the way it had come down on Grimsby all his life, and somewhere very far away above them, over the terrace town of Varkatul, the small red moon they called the Widow was rising for the second time that month, and in the market square of the terrace town, at the head of a fresh grave with a war axe planted in it, a young war chief named Grokur was standing quietly with his mother the matriarch on one side of him, and a warden princess named Usarai on the other, and none of the three of them was speaking either, because there are some silences that belong to everyone and that no one has the right to fill. The story reached the ridges by the end of the month. It reached the low country by the end of the season. It reached the far shores by the end of the year. It reached the coalition much sooner than that. Somewhere in a room without windows, a man in a grey uniform sat with a thin file on his desk and read a name on the file for the third time in one evening, and then closed the file, and then put the file in a drawer, and then locked the drawer, and then, after a moment's thought, took the drawer out of the desk entirely and carried it down a corridor and down a set of stairs and into a room with a very heavy door, and locked it in there. He did not open it again. He was not, at that stage of his life, a foolish man. And down on Cleethorpes Road, in the small kitchen of the small terraced house in the grey port of Grimsby, Neil Barrow finished his tea, kissed his sister on the forehead, said good night, went upstairs and went to bed. His father's spade leaned against the wall by the coat hooks in the hallway. In the morning he would take it out to the workshop behind the house and finish the batch of shovels he had been working on when the call had come. There were, he had counted before he had left, 11 of them left to finish. 2 of them were already spoken for by a farmer in Louth. The rest, he thought, he would keep in the workshop for a while and see if anyone came asking. You never quite knew, in his trade, who was going to come asking. He slept without dreaming. In the market of Varkatul, 5 parsecs away, the widow set at dawn, and the second moon rose behind her, and the fresh grave at the center of the terrace town held its silence, and the war axe planted at its head caught the pale grey light of a new morning, and someone, somewhere in the town, began quietly to sing a hymn in a minor key that had come to them from a country whose name they still could not quite pronounce. She had thought, when she had climbed down from her palanquin in the market that first evening, that she was going to watch a man die. She had been trained for that. She had believed herself ready for it. What she had not been trained for, and what no warden in the memory of the Emerald Tusk had been trained for, was the possibility that the man would not die at all, and that in his not dying he would remake the shape of the pact between 2 peoples who had been circling each other for 100 years without knowing how to stop. It had turned out that the way to stop, Usarai thought, was not with a treaty and not with a war, it was with a shovel. It was with a man who did not step around a body. It was with a cup of tea and a chair. It was with the small, stubborn courtesy of a widower from a cold port who had refused, at the very last, to be a prop in someone else's story. That was the whole of it. That was the whole man. She would carry that lesson home. She would put it into the archives of the Emerald Tusk. She would teach it, in the years to come, to the young wardens who came through her school. And she would teach it plainly, without ornament, in the way it deserved to be taught. Some evenings, when a young warden asked her why the pact between the 7 ridges and the humans held so firm after all this time, when so many other pacts in the low country had come apart, she would look at the young warden across her desk and she would say, in her slow, careful common tongue, that the pact held because it had been sealed not by a lord and not by a king, but by an old orc who had died in a market and a man from a cold port who had refused to walk past. And when the young warden pressed for more, she would smile and shake her head and go back to her paperwork, because wardens do not tell the whole of a story that is not theirs to tell. They only witness. What a journey! The real strength in this valley was never the 200 warriors on the ridges or the blade at the matriarch's elbow. The real weapon was a widower with a shovel and the plain refusal to walk past a dead man. If this story moved you, drop a like, because that is what keeps sagas like this one alive on the channel. Share it with anyone who loves a story of a quiet human against an impossible sky. Subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss the next HFY epic. And tell me down in the comments, if you had stood in that market with Usarai, would you have shouted at Neil to run, or would you have picked up a second spade and dug beside him? Keep your eyes on the empty places out there. Something is always digging.